Can we be free if we mindlessly follow a road simply because others have paved it? Intentional living is about being true agents, living our own lives, knowing that we will be held accountable for every decision. It is about questioning the road we are on, no matter how many others we find on it, no matter how well laid out it might look. For a Christian, intentional living is about finding and forging the path that was destined for us. But to do this, we have to go through a process of ridding ourselves of so-called Christian opinions, cultures, and traditions. At times, we need to question and even reject what has falsely been propagated as the Christian way. We must learn to discern, learn not to fear people, and be brave enough to go against the stream. For a long time, I hadn't the slightest clue that I had fallen victim to religious culture propaganda. Only after getting married and going through a chaotic time did I realize that I had built my life on what others had deemed fundamental. Some signs were that I often felt guilty when I hadn't sinned, felt a lot of social pressure, and started planning ahead based on what others had told me a Christian woman should or shouldn't be like, or should and shouldn't do. All the while, something in me started to harden, to die. It took a lot of searching, studying, and falling apart for me to realize that too much of what is called biblical Christianity is just Christian culture or tradition, something I was not obligated to follow. And sadly, the pressure to adhere to these ways was not only in my imagination. These cultural ways of doing became so ingrained in me that I believed they were God's way. Lifestyles, the right way, do's and don'ts, methods that have nothing to do with holiness fall into this category. And we are often judged severely by ourselves and others for going against these cultures and traditions. Questioning the religious culture we find ourselves in is no easy task, and doing so can lead to a lot of criticism, judgment, unsolicited advice, and rejection. It is very difficult for some Christians to hear and accept that ways they have labeled biblical Christian ways are just culture. This does not mean that they are ill-intentioned or villains, just that they might have a difficult time in accepting and showing mercy to others who are not adhering to that culture. It often leads to an unnecessary separation between believers, rendering them unable to fellowship. This can happen between Christians from the same town or even Christians from different countries. Religious culture is often in opposition to wisdom. The so-called right way of doing is often inflexible, rigid, and cruel, blinds us and prevents us from walking in wisdom. I am not referring to things that Scripture clearly prohibits, promotes, or commands, but to what happens when others convince us that the way they have done it because it worked for them is the way we should do it, even if it would lead to difficulties, loss, or even suffering. It is also often pious, unnecessarily strict, unreasonable, and legalistic. When we go against it, others often treat it as sin, shunning us or instructing us on the so-called only right method. But wisdom is flexible and can look different for almost every situation and brings about the best outcome. It does not lead to difficulty, pain, or suffering. Religious culture is often repeated, drilled into the minds of its subjects, and closely resembles propaganda. It takes a lot of sources outside of Scripture to get someone to adhere to its specific rules, and then claims that it comes directly from Scripture. Scriptures are often twisted, applied outside of its context, misused, or wrongly emphasized to support a specific culture or tradition. It is often preached from the pulpit and by people we deem highly religious, which only proves how desperately we need to personally rethink certain things. I'm not talking about small matters, though some churches do get hung up on silly things like whether wearing jeans or formal pants is more Christian, which is the type of time-wasting nonsense that can easily form part of Christian culture. I am talking about big things like whether a woman is allowed to be economically active, whether it is sin to send your child to public school, whether it is enough to simply be a hard worker and provide for the family, and even things like breaking the will of your child. The list goes on and on. When we consider our lifestyle, we need to be extra careful. This topic is breeding ground for ill-informed, naive, narrow-minded opinions and so-called wisdom that can creep in and cause a lot of damage in our personal lives in the name of so-called spirituality, because it causes us to conform instead of apply wisdom. The road of wisdom might have been abandoned a long time ago, but as long as we live, we can still search for it. Although this is a relatively new endeavor for me, I have changed my mind about many things during the past year. Things I was convinced came straight from scripture, but simply didn't. The progress has been slow and painful, but the reward is a free spirit that stands before God alone, raw, bare, and with nothing to defend myself with. A heart that isn't satisfied by easy, old, unquestioned paths, but that desperately seeks wisdom, that desperately seeks life.